In New Mexico, there is a very deep body of water that formed after a sinkhole filled with water. It's become a very popular diving site over the years because of the clear blue waters above the hole. But at the bottom of the hole sits a very small opening. It can be compared to the drain of your sink. This hole is just barely large enough for divers to fit through with their tanks. Once through the hole, the diver would be met with countless networks of tunnels and caves that have never been explored before. In 1976, two divers were exploring that section of the blue hole when they unexpectedly got lost, leading to their deaths by drowning. Once down there, the police would have a hard time locating the bodies because they started to get lost as well. After the bodies were brought up to the surface, the police conveyed to the owners of the land that the specific section of the cave is way too dangerous and no one should be allowed down there until it has been professionally mapped. The owners eventually deciding to seal off the hole by bolting down a large metal gate before layering boulders on it. They chose this method instead of getting the cave mapped to avoid any more unnecessary fatalities. This would not stop curious divers. In 2016, a diving organization called the ADM Exploration Foundation, that goes around the world mapping caves, reached out to the landowners of the Blue Hole and offered to professionally map out the forbidden section of the cave. The owners were hesitant, but eventually granted them permission. It should be noted that this would be the first time in 40 years that anyone entered the forbidden section. On March 26, 2016, the gate and boulders were removed. The Blue Hole was now deemed open. Shane Thompson, one of the divers, a part of the group, was a former diving instructor for the US Navy before becoming an advanced scuba instructor in San Diego, all of which added up to 20 years of diving experience. Shane was given the role of a safety diver, who would stay on land while the other diver, Mike Young, would go down first and explore the upper sections of the cave. But on the morning of the dive, as Mike Young entered the water, a couple of minutes later, Shane would follow. He recalls as he was making his way down the main cavern section, looking up and seeing Shane swimming down towards him. This puzzled Mike, but he figured someone must have told Shane to come down with him. So he didn't think much of it, and both Mike and Shane continue on swimming down. Each meter they descend, the darker it gets, until eventually squeezing their bodies through the tiny entrance that led to the pitch-black forbidden section. Not being able to see anything, they immediately turn on their high-grade flashlights, but as they continue swimming down, more and more silt is starting to be kicked up. The cave had not been explored for 40 years, so everything that had settled was now being thrown in the faces of Shane and Mike. Their lights would prove to be non-effective. Being the experienced cave divers they were, unfazed, they kept slowly moving forward until Shane spotted a tunnel to the right of them. Based on what they could see, it seemed that at the end of this tunnel, about 30 feet down, there was an opening that led to a much larger cavern. What they did not realize is that the tunnel started wide but eventually goes down to a point. So they start making their way down this tunnel. Silt is now being more aggressively thrown into their faces, so they can't tell that the space is getting narrower and narrower. This was not an easy hole to fit through. As they get closer and closer to the hole, they suddenly get stuck. Shane gets stuck first. Mike, following behind him, could not see this and gets crammed between Shane's leg and the wall. Staying calm, Mike begins to slowly push himself backwards to become unwedged, but Shane begins frantically kicking in panic. Mike continues to slowly move back, while Shane, still in total disarray, begins moving forward, squeezing himself further down the narrow opening, until he was forced into the cavern on the opposite side. Mike, now safe in the main hallway, waits for Shane to do exactly what he did, move himself backwards out of the tunnel. But when Shane didn't show up, Mike went back down looking for him. Now back at the tiny opening, Mike pokes his head through and scans his light, but could not see Shane anywhere. What he did see was different exits that lead out of this cavern through tunnels. Mike was now in a moral dilemma. He wanted to go look for Shane, but this section of the cave was unexplored and he didn't know where any of the tunnels led to. He figured Shane couldn't have gone far so he began squeezing himself down this hole for a second time. Barely making it through the hole, Mike, now in the cavern, points his flashlight up and continues swimming through the widest tunnel he could see. The tunnel continued to wind and wind until it came to a dead end, where he would see Shane, deceased, with his mouthpiece out of his mouth. Knowing the risk of doing a body recovery alone, Mike would have to make the treacherous trip out of the cave to alert the authorities to assist with Shane's body recovery. It is said that when Shane squeezed himself through the hole, he was so disorientated upon being thrusted into the cavern that he thought he had turned around somehow, and the tunnel he was now looking at was the way out, which we now unfortunately know was a dead end. After Shane's body was recovered, the forbidden section was resealed and has remained closed to this day. Yet another story that shows us the dangers that come with cave diving. In open water, if you're in trouble, you swim up. In a cave, it's a different story. Regardless, rest in peace to Shane, gone but never forgotten. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.